So this book, Critical Terms in Religious Studies, came out in 1998, which is actually the same year I got my PhD and my first job in religious studies. And it made a big splash at the time. It was a very big deal in the department I was in at the time because one of my colleagues had written one of the chapters. But there's also a sense that this was the state of the art. Basic categories that had been used for centuries in religious studies were being questioned, they were being deconstructed. Experience, person, culture, sacrifice, territory, time. There are aspects of this book that I think have survived, that have aged well, but others really represent, I think, what happened when postmodernism took over and became the exclusive approach in religious studies. So I want to read to you from one of the chapters, the chapter on the person. So what is the person in religious studies? Can there be a complementarity of thinking strategies or heuristic arrangements that access the diverse empiricities that complicate the definition of the person? The cathartic power of radical postmodern criticism in writing unreadable texts, forcing recognition of the opaque materiality of texts, or giving a carnivalesque crazing to the surface of thinking and the valuation of an errant thinking, all contribute to a style of non-containment of thinking without silencing its voice. Now, besides the fact that this actually makes no sense in English, it actually, I think, illustrates this problem we got into in religious studies when postmodernism became the dominant approach. It's against explanation. We can't explain anything because explanation is reductionistic. It assumes there's some kind of thing out there that we can explain. What you're left with is either just collection of interesting anecdotes. So here's an instance of this religious ceremony in this place at this time, or word games like this, where you're really kind of engaged in a one-upmanship of who can come up with the most self-deconstructing sentence. In other areas of the humanities, people were already in the 90s getting very tired of this, and there was definitely a kickback, mostly coming from people in disciplines that are on the border of the humanities, like psychology, but arguing that this had really gone too far. We need to go back to some kind of sense of human beings as biological organisms that have an evolved nature, that were produced by evolution, that have a kind of innate cognitive structure. And so around the same time, so in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were a series of books, books like E.O. Wilson's Consilience or Steve Pinker's The Blank Slate was very important. The Psychological Foundations of Culture was also very influential. And one feature of all of these contributions is this shift back to strong nativism, if we want to talk about it that way, focusing on the evolved cognitive structures that human beings come equipped with, pre-equipped with. There was not a whole lot of work in the early period on culture as an independent force in religious cognition and behavior. And this is something that's changed more recently. So there's been a swing back toward the middle a bit, taking culture into account as an independent force. And there are a variety of people involved in this movement. So here I want to begin lecture 4 by talking to some of the scholars who are involved in the Religion, Cognition, and Culture group at Aarhus University in Denmark. And they have been at the forefront of this movement to try to swing back to the middle, take seriously our biological nature, the fact that we have these bottom-up evolved cognitive capacities, but also talk about what they refer to as top-down effects, the way in which culture affects cognition and how you need to take this into account to understand religion properly.
So we have it in us, in our psychology, to learn from each other. And this is what culture is. We're learning culture. We're learning this network of knowledge. It's also a network of feelings. And we're trying to plug in. We can't download all of our culture, but we can learn how to plug in, okay? If we can just get into that matrix somehow, then our very being is functional and useful and meaningful. This requires, if you want to get a hold on human cognition, requires that you both take the bottom-up processes of the brain and the body, but also the top-down processes of culture and social context.
Now, obviously, researchers in the early phase of CSR were not unaware that human beings had culture. It's just the focus was more on how that culture is getting filtered by the structures, innate structures of the human mind. A very dominant model of culture that was being used by a lot of the people in the field was that proposed originally by Dan Sperber, of thinking in terms of culture as epidemiology. So we have a model of how germs, how viruses or bacteria spread, and how they're subject to the filtering of our immune system, and they adapt in response to this. This was used as a model for how culture spread. So we've got cultural ideas getting generated, getting passed down, but the ones that are successful are the ones that are able to either get past the defenses of our innate mind or that are particularly well adapted to the structure of our innate mind. This is a very powerful idea, and it's a very important one. But what it tended to de-emphasize is the fact that culture can have its own evolutionary process independent of the human mind, and that culture can, in a variety of ways, actually affect the human mind in important ways, reshape it in important ways. So if we want to understand cultural evolution, if we want to understand why some ideas succeed and others don't, we can't just look at the innate structure of the human mind. We have to look at the cultural background against which these ideas are operating. So let's go back now to Drs. Gertz and Sorensen and hear a little bit about their thoughts on this topic.
We can make one small example here. So why would reincarnation beliefs be so widely spread in Western Europe today? I mean, we can pretty much follow the historical trajectory. They are introduced in the current version in 1870s and 80s mostly by theosophists and others who had this kind of positive Orientalism. And now, at least in Denmark, in surveys, you have up to 20% saying that they're kind of favorable towards the thought of reincarnation might be a possibility. And these are the same people who are probably member of the Danish Lutheran Church, which opposes this very idea. So it's an idea that spreads very easily. Now, how do we explain that this idea spreads very easily at the same time as ISKCON, also known as the Hare Krishna movement, that everybody, I guess, have met some of these folks that run around in weird orange clothes and sing and dance in the street, have been a spectacular failure in missionizing in Europe. I mean, they hardly have more members now than they did 50 years ago, which is a fraction of the population you don't even want to, count. It's such a small one. Now, they have a very highly relevant, counterintuitive small blue god called Krishna, but it seems like it doesn't have anything to latch onto, right? So this idea seems to be blocked out. It's very hard for them to convert people. But the idea of reincarnation is highly successful. Why? Well, if we start looking more into this idea and how it changed slightly when it moved from India into Europe, is that first of all, it changed from being a circular conception that you could be reborn as a dog or a mouse or a snake or whatever, into a progressive one. So it changed. Western conceptions of reincarnation usually don't entail that you can be born as something less than human. So you're always born on the same level or higher. So it connects to this idea of spiritual evolution. And there you have the explanation why this was a success. It latched on to two very prevalent cultural schemas at the time in the West, namely progressivism, that societies and civilization were progressing, and evolution. The idea of evolution connected to this idea of spiritual evolution. And of course, in spiritual evolution, you won't be reborn as a dog, right? That would be a regression and not an evolution. So reincarnation and beliefs in reincarnation became very popular in Western Europe simply because they had something to latch onto that people already thought was probable. So therefore, people can find reincarnation seems to be there. Yeah, that's a very reasonable idea. A small blue god, that seems to be a very unreasonable idea, right? So that's an example of, in a certain sense, how cultural configurations, how already established religions, or in this case, ideas that actually were opposed to traditional religion, like belief in evolution and progression, how they influence the development of religious ideas over time.
One way in which the equal importance of genes and culture, innate structure and inherited cultural structure, have been theorized has been dual inheritance theory. So this is a theory that has been arguing human beings are shaped by two streams of information transfer. We've got genetic information transfer that's happening through biological generations, but we also have cultural evolution, cultural transmission that's following its own independent cultural evolutionary trajectory. One of the central innovators in the area of gene culture coevolutionary theory or dual inheritance theory has been my colleague Joseph Henrich. So we're going to talk to him now about how understanding human beings as fundamentally a cultural species is really crucial to understanding the phenomenon of religion.
More than any other animal, we've evolved to acquire vast stretches of our behavioral repertoire, ideas, beliefs, and values from other members of our social group. So for very basic things like how to find food or build shelters or make tools, humans are reliant on learning from other creatures in a way that we don't find in other species. And rather than setting up a dichotomy between culture on the one hand and genes on the other, what we try to do is apply the logic of natural selection to think about human learning. So how would our capacity for culture, our ability to learn from others, have evolved in adaptive ways that allow us to most effectively extract adaptive ideas, beliefs, and values from our social milieu. So once you have that idea, you can begin to theorize, well, what kinds of things should people pay attention to? What content should be particularly attractive to them? Who in their social milieu should be particularly important for learning from? So we know, for example, that young children will key in on information about dangerous animals, and they'll readily acquire, and this will stick in their heads, and they'll remember which animals are dangerous and which are not.
More so than algebra.
Exactly. So there's a bias in what they remember, what's salient to them, and we can get to this through the application of natural selectionist thinking and thinking about how our minds might have been shaped. And we find this in different societies. But by the same token, we also are selective about who we attend to. So learning from more prestigious people, learning from more successful people, competent people, using cues like same sex or same ethnicity or dialect to help learn those things that are most likely to be adaptive or useful to you later in life. So you can think of humans as adaptive learners. So now everything becomes an evolutionary explanation, and any given explanation may involve some amount of learning from other people, and then that's a cultural input in it. And so we know that culture affects large swaths of human psychology and decision making, but it's got to be intermixed with what we know about sort of basic psychological processes, basic aspects of cognition.
Right, great. So how would you apply this to religion, explaining religious behavior and belief?
Yeah, so what my colleagues and I have done is to say, humans have some basic psychological processes, like our ability to represent other minds, and the fact that we tend to think dualistically, that we can separate the mind and the body, even though minds and bodies can actually be separated. And this gives some basic tools for cultural evolution to work with. And one of the forces of cultural evolution that I'm most interested in is intergroup competition. And so we can then favor certain kinds of supernatural agents that allow groups to succeed in intergroup competition, that make a social group more cohesive, more cooperative, enforce internal harmony. And this is going to favor supernatural agents which can do those things. And this might be an agent that has the power to punish and monitor and make sure that people obey the local norms even when they don't have to, and they're outside the monitoring eyes of other members of their community. Okay. It also might favor rituals that help build solidarity among social groups. So this is taking the basic ingredients that are supplied by our evolved aspects of our cognition, but then building on it and rejiggering it in ways that lead to group benefits.
How does the building and rejiggering happen? So is there an evil genius who's thinking, what's the best way to design a religion so that we can cooperate better? What are the mechanisms that you'd propose?
I think that one interesting way to approach that is to look at actual cases. In Papua New Guinea, there's this region of Papua New Guinea called the Sepik region, and their villages typically don't grow above 300 people. And anthropologists in the 1950s and 60s were puzzled by how come they couldn't scale up beyond 300 people. And then they discovered one village that had 500 people. So an anthropologist named Donald Tuzin went to that village. And this is particularly interesting because this is a region of endemic warfare, where your ability to win fights and battles depends on how many soldiers or how many men you can put on the battlefield. So strangely, these other communities couldn't scale up, but this one had figured out. And what had happened is this group had copied the ritual and economic, integrated ritual and economic and religious beliefs of a very successful group. But in the course of copying them, they made some modifications or twists by mistake. These were errors in the transmission process that made the ritual system even better, and had a belief system that had supernatural punishment and had gods that were bigger and gods of the village rather than just of the small clan. And this allowed this group to scale up and then succeed where the other groups didn't.
So this mistaken copying would be an analog to mutations in genetic evolution.
Exactly.
So it's a random change that then has adaptive benefits.
And there's a selective process because they learned this stuff from a group that was already successful, and then in the process of transmission, it got modified.
Okay.
And they were trying to copy it exactly because they thought if they could get the exact same beneficial effects, then they would be able to win, but it turns out they actually got something better.
Okay.
And so if you step back from this and zoom out, this process is going on all the time. Sometimes when groups copy, they might make a worse copy, and then they just disappear in history. But whenever they get something that's a bit better, that can proliferate.
So understanding human beings as essentially cultural animals also gives us an explanation for why we're so successful as a species, because independently we're not necessarily particularly very impressive as organisms. So now we'll go back to Dr. Henrik again to talk about a theme that he's written about extensively, which is how the accumulation of cultural knowledge, so cumulative cultural evolution, is actually the key to human being success as a species. And this also then is very important for understanding how religion, how human religious evolution and cognition has evolved over time.
What's unique about humans is that they're the only species that has cumulative cultural evolution. And what that means is over generations, one generation figures out some stuff, they pass it on to the next generation who can add, say, new techniques, new aspects to a tool, some new food repertoire, and then that all gets transmitted to the next generation. It can accumulate over time so that after a few generations, you have behavioral repertoires, say food processing strategies, tool making strategies, house making strategies, and go on, that's more complex than any individual could figure out in their lifetime. And so this means in order to survive as a human, you've got to be willing to accept that we're going to make this tool and there's going to be 27 steps, and you're not going to know if step 13 is necessary or unnecessary. So you just have to copy all the steps. So I call this the origin of faith. Humans learn to be able to put faith in cultural practices, even if it violates their own intuitions or their own experience. So you might, for example, be willing to follow a detoxification process on cassava or some poisonous thing that has to be detoxified through processing. But you yourself have actually never eaten it. You don't even know if it's actually toxic. You just know when we process this food, we do it. And this helps you to survive. And there's lots of cases where when food that needs a lot of detoxification has been transported to other places, people don't adopt this and they get sick and they're not able to easily reproduce the cumulative cultural technology. So this means we can put faith in this body of culturally transmitted knowledge. And this opens the door to putting faith in things like ritual practices and supernatural agents, because as a young learner, you don't really know what's in the world, and even if your intuition say these things might not exist, if everybody else in your community thinks they are and they seem to be successful and whatnot, then you're willing to put some faith in those. And so this opens the door to the emergence of religion.
We'll be talking in much more detail about cultural evolution in Module 3. For now, I want to conclude Module 1 with Lecture 5, where we'll get into a rather philosophical issue about what it means to integrate the sciences and humanities, what the sciences and humanities actually are as modes of inquiry, and then also a specter that always comes up in any sort of naturalistic or scientific approach to human beings, the issue of reductionism.